Welcome, dear friends, to a quiet corner of the forest where mice, hedgehogs, and squirrels share gentle days and little adventures. Pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle in, and let's wander together into the cozy world of woodland tales. Whispers along the hedge. Morning came softly to Elderberry Lane, a narrow track of grass and roots that wound its way between thick hedgerows and moss-green stones. The sun was pale, just lifting above the treetops, and the dew clung like beads of glass to every leaf and bramble. Hazel Greenwhisker, a field mouse of quick step and quicker thoughts, bustled out of her burrow with a basket over her arm. She was bound for Bramley's mill, where she hoped to fetch flour for her grandmother's bread. But halfway down the lane, she found her way blocked. A small cart, old but sturdy, sat tipped to one side. One wheel had broken clean through, its rim snapped, and its spokes splayed like a fan. Beside it stood old Mr. Thorne, the hedgehog carpenter, rubbing his spines with worry. A load of kindling lay scattered in the ditch, and his spectacles slipped dangerously down his nose. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," Hazel called, setting down her basket. "Oh dear, that looks troublesome." "Troublesome indeed," the hedgehog muttered, pushing at the cart in vain. "I was hauling this wood for the baker's oven. Needed it today, else his loaves will never rise. But my wheel's gone and split on me. Too far for me to carry all this on my back." Hazel crouched to inspect the wheel. It was cracked clean through, no mending it here in the lane. But Hazel was not one to give up. "We'll get it sorted," she said firmly. "If you'll fetch your tools, I'll go gather help." And off she darted, whiskers twitching with determination. First she found Pip and Lark, the young squirrel twins, busy chasing each other up a beech tree. "There's work to be done," Hazel told them. "Mr. Thorne's cart's broken, and we'll need nimble paws." Eager for a challenge, the twins scrambled down at once. Next, Hazel stopped at Clover Badger's burrow. Clover, broad and kind-eyed, came lumbering out with her sleeves rolled high. "A cartwheel, is it? I'll bring rope and my good strong back," she declared. By the time Hazel returned to Elderberry Lane, a little company had gathered. Mr. Thorne had fetched his toolbox, and Bramwell, the stout mole from across the meadow, had trundled over with a plank of wood balanced on his shoulder. Together, they set to work. Clover lifted the cart so Bramwell could wedge a log beneath. Pip and Lark gathered stray branches from the ditch. Mr. Thorne measured and sawed with steady care, while Hazel ran to and fro with nails, pegs, and twine. The lane was soon filled with the pleasant rhythm of work, the rasp of a saw, the tap-tap of hammer, the creak of rope tightening. Birds flitted overhead, curious at the commotion. At last, after much puffing and tugging, the wheel was set firm again. Not new, but strong enough to roll. Mr. Thorne let out a long sigh of relief, wiping his brow. Well done indeed. Without you all, I'd have been stranded here till sundown." Hazel smiled as she dusted off her paws. Neighbors are for helping, after all. Together, they loaded the kindling back onto the cart. The sun was higher now, glinting warmly off the hedges, and though Hazel's morning errand had been delayed, she felt richer for the detour. For there was something deeply comforting in mending broken things. Not just wood and wheel, but the threads that tied them all together. And as the little party dispersed, Hazel thought to herself that Elderberry Lane had never looked so bright as it did that morning, with friends walking side by side, and a cart that rolled steadily once more. The day after the cartwheel was mended, Hazel set out again with her basket, this time determined to make it to Bramley's mill without interruption. The path along Elderberry Lane was damp with dew, and the hedges smelled faintly of wild mint where the sun had warmed their leaves. Hazel hummed as she went, her whiskers twitching at the thought of warm bread that evening. Near the bend by Old Mossy Stone, she spied something glinting in the grass. At first she thought it a dewdrop, but as she drew closer, she saw it was a button, a bright brass button, no bigger than her paw, but finely made, with a delicate pattern etched along its rim. Hazel picked it up and turned it over. It looked important, not the sort of thing one dropped lightly. She tucked it into her basket and continued on her way, though her thoughts lingered on the mystery. By the time she returned from the mill, the button weighed heavily in her pocket, almost as though it tugged her back toward Elderberry Lane. That afternoon, she set out to find its owner. First, she visited Mr. Thorne, who was trimming kindling by his workshop. "Not mine, dear," he said with a shake of his spectacles. "I've no coat that would fit such a grand button." Next, she asked Clover Badger, who was polishing a brass kettle until it gleamed. "I'd keep it if it were mine," Clover chuckled. "But no, I've never seen the like." Hazel made her way to Bramble Mole's burrow. He squinted at the button, holding it close to his nose. "Fine work, that," he rumbled. "But I've no use for buttons. Always slip through my paws, they do." The day wore on, and Hazel found herself with no answer. She returned home and set the button on her table, where the firelight danced across its golden surface. "Who could it belong to?" she murmured. The next morning brought a clue. As Hazel walked to the meadow, she found little Pip's squirrel perched on a branch, sulking. "What's the matter, Pip?" she called. Pip scowled. "It's my coat. I lost a button yesterday, and now it won't stay closed. Mama says I must be more careful, but I swear it popped off all by itself." Hazel smiled, reaching into her pocket. "Would it be this one?" Pip's eyes went wide. "That's it." "Oh, thank you, Hazel." He hopped down and hugged the button tight to his chest. "I thought it was gone forever." Together they returned to Clover, who quickly sewed the button back in place with neat stitches. Pip twirled proudly in his mended coat, tail whisking. That evening, Hazel sat by her fire, smiling at the day's small adventure. A lost button might seem a trifling thing, but in the hollow, even small losses mattered. And when found, they stitched neighbors a little closer together, just like thread through cloth. A week later, the skies turned heavy with gray, and rain began to fall. It pattered softly at first, then drummed harder, until Elderberry Lane ran with rivulets of water. Hazel Greenwhisker sat by her window, listening to the steady tap of raindrops on the thatch. She was just settling down with her knitting when a knock came at the door. It was Lark, Pip's sister, looking worried. "Hazel, there's water coming into our burrow. Mama says it's trickling down the back wall. Could you come?" Hazel pulled on her cloak and hurried through the rain. The squirrel family's burrow was warm and cheerful, but sure enough, water was seeping in along a crack near the pantry. Pip and Lark were frantically moving sacks of nuts to higher shelves while their mother fretted over her preserves. "Not to worry," Hazel said briskly. "We'll set it right, but we'll need help." She dashed through the rain to fetch Bramble Mole, who knew more about earth and stone than anyone else. Bramble arrived with his tool bag slung across his shoulder, grumbling good-naturedly. "Water's a sneaky thing," he said, examining the wall. "Always finds its way where you least want it." With Hazel holding a lantern, Bramble dug a small trench outside the burrow to divert the rainwater away. Pip and Lark carried buckets, bailing what had already seeped inside, while their mother mopped with old cloths. Hazel comforted the little ones with jokes, making the work seem more like a game. It was messy, muddy business, but at last the water slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. The burrow smelled damp, but it was safe again. When the work was done, Mrs. Squirrel brewed hot cider for everyone, and they sat together by the fire, steam curling up from their mugs. Bramble's whiskers dripped rain, and Hazel's cloak was spattered with mud, but they were smiling all the same. "Thank you, Hazel," Pip said earnestly. "You always know what to do." Hazel shook her head. "I just know who to ask," she said with a wink toward Bramble. "That's what neighbors are for." The rain continued outside, but inside the burrow, the hearth crackled warmly, and laughter filled the air. Hazel thought to herself that even on the wettest, gloomiest days, friendship was the surest kind of sunshine. Seasons turned slowly, as they always do. The rain gave way to frost, and soon Elderberry Lane was edged with rime, the hedges bare and brittle. Hazel woke one morning to find the world white with hoarfrost, every twig and stone rimmed with glittering ice. She pulled her cloak tight and stepped outside. Her breath puffed in little clouds, and her whiskers tingled in the chill. Along the lane she met Mr. Thorne, carrying a bundle of twigs for kindling, cold enough to freeze one's whiskers solid. He grunted, though he looked quite cheerful beneath his scarf. The hollow adjusted itself to winter's ways. Clover Badger laid in jars of root stew. Bramble kept his workshop stove burning from dawn till dusk, repairing tools for neighbors. Pip and Lark busied themselves sweeping snow from the hedgerows to keep paths open. One morning, Hazel noticed a gap in the hedge near old mossy stone. Where once the brambles had been thick, there was now a thin place, as though branches had snapped under frost. Through the gap, one could see beyond the hollow, out into the deeper woods. The sight filled Hazel with a mix of wonder and unease. She had never gone so far herself. The hollow was safe and known, but the woods beyond whispered of secrets. She mentioned the gap to Mr. Thorne, who nodded gravely. "We'll need to mend it in spring," he said. "Hedges keep us safe, and safe we must remain." But for Hazel, the thought of the opening lingered. Each time she passed, she found her eyes drawn to it. She wondered what lay beyond. The rustle of distant leaves, the hush of untrodden paths. And though she kept her paws firmly within Elderberry Lane, Hazel felt something stir quietly in her heart, a longing for discovery. She did not yet know what form it would take. For now, she tucked her cloak closer, lit her lantern, and returned home to her burrow where the fire burned bright. But still, at night, she dreamed of the gap in the hedge and of the stories that might wait on the other side. Frost held the hollow in its silver grip. Each morning, Hazel Greenwhisker padded down Elderberry Lane, her breath curling in the air, her cloak pulled snug. It was on one such morning, just as the sun brushed the hedges with pale gold, that she noticed something unusual. Near the gap in the hedge by old mossy stone, faint marks patterned the snow. Hazel knelt to look closer. They were small prints, but not those of any neighbor she knew. Too wide for a mouse, too neat for a rabbit, and too delicate for Bramble Mole's heavy tread. They looked as if something had stepped lightly, almost cautiously, through the opening in the hedge and into the hollow. Hazel felt a prickle along her whiskers. She glanced about, but the lane lay quiet, save for the distant chatter of sparrows. The prince led only a little way, circling curiously near the hedge, then vanished where the snow had melted in the sun. Later that day, she told Clover Badger. "Strange tracks, you say?" Clover mused, stirring a pot of stew. "Best to keep an eye out. Could be nothing more than a stray bird hopping along." But Bramble Mole was more serious. "The hedge keeps us safe," he rumbled, wiping his paws on his apron. "If there's something slipping through, we ought to know what it is." The neighbors agreed to watch more carefully, though no one seemed truly afraid. The hollow had always been peaceful, after all. Yet Hazel found herself thinking of the tracks whenever she passed the gap, her eyes searching the snow for signs. That evening, as she lit her lantern, she wondered about the creature that had left them. Was it friend or stranger? Did it watch them from beyond the hedge? And why had it turned back instead of venturing farther in? The lantern's glow warmed her thoughts, but curiosity, once stirred, is hard to quiet. Not long after Hazel spotted the tracks, winter tightened its hold. One night, heavy snow fell without pause, blanketing the hollow so thickly that by morning most doors were blocked. Hazel awoke to find her own burrow's entrance buried up to the lintel. She pushed and shoveled until at last she squeezed out into a world muffled in white. Elderberry Lane had vanished beneath drifts. Only the tips of hedges and the tops of lanterns showed. For a moment, Hazel felt small indeed, like a leaf adrift in a sea of snow. From somewhere nearby came muffled voices. "Hallo? Anyone there?" It was Pip and Lark, peering from a tunnel they had dug up from their burrow. Their whiskers were tipped with frost, but their eyes shone with excitement. "It's like living in a snow cave." Pip laughed. Hazel smiled. "It's beautiful, but we'll need to clear the paths. We can't have everyone snowed in." Soon neighbors emerged one by one. Bramble with his sturdy shovel, Clover Badger wrapped in scarves, and Mr. Thorn the Hedgehog puffing clouds of steam with every breath. Together they set to work, carving tunnels and lanes through the drifts. Snow flew in sprays as paws and claws dug steadily, and soon Elderberry Lane looked like a network of bright corridors walled with gleaming white. There was laughter, too. Pip and Lark turned their shoveling into a contest, while Clover built a little alcove in the snow wall to rest her basket. Hazel felt her heart swell at the sight. Though winter had buried them, the hollow shone brighter for the cheer of its folk. When evening came, lanterns glowed warmly against the snowy corridors, their light reflecting like stars caught in crystal. Hazel thought it one of the loveliest sights she had ever seen. Still, as she passed the hedge gap on her way home, she noticed the snow there was disturbed again, as though something had pressed against it from the other side. She paused, lantern in paw, and for the briefest moment thought she heard a faint rustle. But when she leaned closer, all was still. The days grew shorter, shadows falling early across the hollow. Hazel tried not to think too much of the gap or the tracks, though they stayed in her mind like a tune one cannot forget. It was near dusk when the matter came to a head. Hazel had gone out to fetch firewood from Clover's store. The air was crisp, the snow crunching under her paws, and the lanterns flickered softly along the lane. As she passed near old Mossy's stone, she froze. There, just beyond the gap in the hedge, stood a figure, small, with fur pale as frost, and eyes wide and watchful. A mouse, yet not one Hazel knew. Its cloak was ragged, patched with scraps of bark and thread, and it clutched a bundle tied with twine. The stranger blinked at her, startled as a deer, and half turned as if to flee. Hazel's heart thumped, but she raised her lantern gently, letting the glow spill across the snow. "Hello there," she said softly. "You're far from home, aren't you?" The mouse hesitated, then nodded. Its voice was small, almost a whisper. I've been walking a long while. I only meant to rest by your hedge." Hazel's first instinct was caution. The hollow was a close, safe place, and strangers rarely came. Yet something in the mouse's eyes tugged at her. Weariness and hope, and perhaps a little fear. "Come," Hazel said kindly. "You must be cold. Let's fetch you to Clover's burrow. There's stew on the fire and blankets enough to share." The stranger's eyes widened, as though such an offer were more surprising than the snow itself. After a pause, it nodded again, and so Hazel led the way, her lantern casting a circle of light through the winter dusk, the stranger following timidly behind. The hollow had long been a place of shelter and kinship, and Hazel thought it only right to keep it so. But as they neared Clover's warm hearth, she could not help but wonder what story this pale traveler carried with them, and why the winter woods had sent them to Elderberry Lane. The hollow had always been a place of familiarity, neighbors known since childhood, paths well-trodden, routine steady as the turning of the seasons. So when Hazel Greenwhisker brought the pale-furred stranger to Clover Badger's burrow, it was as though a new note had entered an old, comfortable song. Clover looked up from her bubbling pot of root stew, surprise widening her kind eyes. "And who have we here?" she asked, her voice as warm as the hearth. The stranger hesitated, paused, clutching their bundle. "My name is Wren," they said quietly. "I was traveling and lost my way." Clover's brows knit with concern. "Then you've found your way now," Sit you down, dear, before you freeze through. She ushered Wren to the fire, draping a blanket about their shoulders. Hazel helped, setting her lantern on the mantel so its glow joined the firelight. Soon Pip and Lark burst in, their tails dusted with snow, and froze at the sight of the newcomer. "Who's that?" Pip whispered loudly, though not loud enough to miss. "A traveler," Hazel explained. "Mind your manners." The twins exchanged wide-eyed glances but obeyed, settling cross-legged near the fire. Wren unwrapped their bundle. Inside was a small loaf of bread, hard with age, and a folded scrap of cloth embroidered with faded flowers. They set it carefully on their lap, as if it were treasure. Hazel's heart tightened. "You've come far, haven't you?" she asked gently. Wren nodded. "My family's burrow lies beyond the pine wood. We had to leave. The river changed course last autumn and flooded our home. My parents went on to seek shelter elsewhere, but I lost the path. I've been walking since." The hollow fell quiet, save for the soft pop of the stew bubbling. Hazel saw sympathy flicker across Clover's face, and even Pip and Lark's chatter stilled. Bramble Mole, who had wandered in with his great shoulders dusted in snow, folded his arms. "A hard journey indeed," he rumbled, "but you'll find no lack of kindness here." Clover ladled out steaming bowls of stew, the scent of carrots and parsnip filling the room. Wren ate slowly at first, as though not certain it was truly theirs, then with growing hunger, eyes shining with gratitude. That evening, Hazel walked home beneath the lantern light, her thoughts circling like snowflakes. She had acted out of instinct, offering Wren warmth and shelter, but she knew the hollow was cautious by nature. A stranger in their midst would raise questions. And yet, as she looked back and saw the fire's glow spilling from Clover's window, she felt certain she had done right. For what was the use of a lantern, if not to guide those who had lost their way? News traveled quickly in the hollow. By morning, nearly every burrow knew of the pale mouse Hazel had led through the hedge. Some spoke with sympathy, others with unease. Hazel walked down Elderberry Lane, her basket on her arm, and caught the murmur of voices. Mrs. Maple the Hare leaned over her gate, confiding to Mr. Thorne, a stranger, in winter no less. What business had they in our lanes? Mr. Thorne, always practical, adjusted his spectacles. Hazel says their home was washed away. That's tragedy enough. Still, it's unusual, and unusual things unsettle folk. When Hazel stopped to greet them, the conversation faltered. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat. "We're glad you helped them, Hazel. Truly, but the hollow has always been close-knit. It will take time for others to see them as neighbor, not stranger." Hazel nodded. She understood, yet her whiskers twitched with frustration. Was kindness not the hollow's way? She thought of Wren's careful bundle, the embroidered cloth folded as though it were the last scrap of home. At Clover's burrow, she found Wren helping tidy the pantry. Pip and Lark hovered nearby, curiosity bubbling over. "What's it like in the pine wood?" Lark asked. "Do the trees really hum when the wind blows through them?" Wren smiled faintly. "They do. It's a lonely sound, but beautiful." Hazel's heart softened. Wren was trying. She could see in the way they offered to sweep, to carry wood, to share what little they had. But trust, she knew, was grown like a hedge, slowly, season by season. That evening, Bramble gathered a few neighbors in his workshop. Hazel attended, though she suspected what was coming. "We must decide," Bramble said gravely, "how to treat this traveler. Shall we offer them a place among us, or see them on their way once the weather clears?" There was murmuring, some in favor, others doubtful. Hazel raised her chin. "Wren is no threat. They need only kindness. Haven't we always said the hollow shines brighter when we share its light?" Clover's deep voice joined hers. "I'll vouch for them. No creature who clutches bread like treasure and helps sweep a neighbor's floor is dangerous." In the end, the gathering agreed to give Wren time. The hollow would watch, wait, and see. It was not the swift welcome Hazel had hoped for, but it was enough. That night, Hazel walked home beneath the stars, lanterns swinging gently. She thought of Wren's shy smile, of the pine woods humming trees, and of how easily misgivings could overshadow compassion. The hollow had been her world since birth, but perhaps it still had room to grow. Days passed, each one cold and sharp, the snow crunching underfoot. Wren remained at Clover's, helping with chores and venturing timidly into the hollow. Some neighbors warmed quickly. Mrs. Maple even offered a jar of blackberry jam, but others kept their distance, cautious still. Hazel decided the time had come for a small gesture, something quiet but meaningful. One morning she walked to the meadow lanterns, where Bramwell was trimming wicks. "I'd like to place a lantern near the hedge," she said, "where I first saw Wren, a sign of welcome." Bramwell scratched his nose. "Some may say it invites more strangers." "Then let it," Hazel said firmly. "Light does not shrink when shared, it grows." And so, together, they carried a sturdy post to old mossy stone. Hazel polished the lantern glass until it gleamed, while Bramwell set the post deep in the frozen ground. When they lit it that evening, its glow spilled through the gap in the hedge, casting warmth into the dark woods beyond. The villagers gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some frowned, but more smiled softly, touched by the sight. Wren stood at the edge, cloak pulled tight, eyes shining. "It's beautiful," they whispered. Hazel felt her whiskers twitch with pride. "It belongs to all of us." A lantern, to say the hollow, is not closed to those who wander. From that night on, the hedge lantern, as it came to be called, was tended like the others. Neighbors took turns trimming its wick and shielding its flame from the wind. And slowly, almost without notice, Wren ceased to be the stranger and became simply Wren, a quiet mouse with pale fur and a knack for sewing ragged cloth into neat patches. Hazel often paused by the hedge lantern as she walked home, its glow steady against the winter night. She thought of the first time she had seen Wren there, half hidden and uncertain, and of how much a single flame could change. The hollow was still the same safe place it had always been, but perhaps now it was just a little wider, its light reaching farther than before. The hollow had always prided itself on neatness. Paths were swept clear of leaves, doorsteps brushed, and the hedges trimmed just so. And if ever a button popped, a sleeve tore, or a patch of cloth frayed, there was Clover Badger with her patient paws and deep basket of threads. But Clover was growing older, and though her stitches were steady, her eyes often watered in the lamplight. One crisp morning, Hazel found Wren seated by Clover's hearth with that faded scrap of embroidered cloth upon their lap. They were sewing, their small paws surprisingly swift and graceful, drawing a thread through the fabric with hardly a falter. Hazel paused in the doorway, fascinated. "You've a gift," she remarked. Wren startled, ears twitching, but managed a small smile. "My mother taught me. When winter nights grew long, we'd mend everything in sight. Scarves, quilts, even sacks for grain. She said there's comfort in knowing each stitch holds something together." Clover chuckled warmly. "It's true enough. Why, these paws are glad for the help." She lifted a pile of clothes and linens from beside her chair. "Neighbors bring their mending each week, you see. There's too much for one pair of eyes now." That day, Hazel suggested gently that Wren try their skill on the hollow's mending basket. Clover agreed, and before long, the little parlor was full of folded garments waiting their turn under Wren's needle. Word spread swiftly. Mrs. Maple sent her worn shawl. Bramwell arrived with patchwork trousers that needed another go. Even Pip and Lark delivered a pair of socks with holes in both heels. Each piece Wren returned looked tidy, the stitches nearly invisible. At first, some neighbors murmured, "Shall we trust a newcomer with our best things?" But when Mrs. Willow's lace collar came back whole and shining, even the doubter softened. Hazel noticed how Wren's shoulders relaxed bit by bit, as if the work itself stitched them into the hollow's fabric. Late one evening, as Hazel walked Wren home beneath the lanterns, she saw them glance at the hedge lantern, its glow steady in the dark. Wren's paws clutched their sewing pouch as though it were an anchor. "I wasn't sure I belonged anywhere," Wren said softly. "But the hollow, it feels like threads pulled snug, keeping me from unraveling." Hazel smiled. "Then perhaps you were meant to be here all along." One morning, Bramble Mole came knocking at Hazel's door, his boots muddied. "Hazel, I need another pair of paws. The brook's overfull after the thaw, and it's flooded part of my workshop." Hazel agreed at once. When she arrived, she found Wren already there, perched nervously by the door. Bramble must have asked them too. "The water seeped under the floorboards," Bramble explained, pointing to a dark dampness spreading along the wall. "We'll need to clear the drain before it worsens." "Hazel, fetch the rake. Wren, bring the buckets." Hazel set to work alongside Wren, who hesitated at first but soon fell into rhythm. They scooped debris from the drain, leaves, twigs, even an old acorn shell, while Bramble guided the flow of water with practiced paws. It was heavy, mucky work, and Wren slipped more than once on the slick stones. Hazel offered her paw. "Steady now." Wren flushed, embarrassed, but gripped her hand gratefully. "I've never worked near water since the flood." Hazel's heart pinched. "Then let this brook show you it can be tamed. Not all water means loss." By midday, the drain ran clear, and the workshop began to dry. Bramble clapped both of them on the shoulders. "Well done. Not half the mess I feared." He offered mugs of hot cider by the fire, steam curling in the air. Wren held theirs carefully, staring into the amber liquid. "I thought I'd be afraid," they admitted. "But with both of you here, it felt almost safe." Hazel exchanged a glance with Bramble, who nodded solemnly. Trust was not built in a single day, but perhaps with each small task, Wren was laying down roots. When they left, Wren lingered by the brook, watching its current glimmer in the afternoon sun. Hazel noticed their shoulders no longer hunched as tightly, and she thought every stitch, every bucket, every step was a kind of mending, not just of garments, but of hearts. It was Lark who first noticed it. One evening the lantern by the green had gone dark. Hazel hurried over with Pip at her heels and found the glass shattered, the wick missing. It looked as though some careless paw had knocked it down. A lantern dark in the hollow was no small matter. Those gentle lights were their comfort against the long nights. A search was quickly arranged. Neighbors scoured the hedge and meadow, lanterns in paw. Wren joined them, pale fur glimmering in the lamplight. They seemed anxious, eyes darting toward the dark where the hedge lantern still burned steadfast. After a long while, Pip cried out, "Here it is." He held up the lantern frame, bent and muddied. The wick and oil flask were gone. "Stolen," Mrs. Maple gasped, perhaps only misplaced. Hazel soothed, though doubt prickled her whiskers. That night, the hollow buzzed with unease. Who would tamper with their lanterns? It felt like a breach of trust in a place that prided itself on safety. But the mystery was solved sooner than expected. 2 days later, Clover found a small nest beneath her shed roof, lined with scraps of cloth, and within it, the missing lantern wick chewed nearly in two. A family of field voles had carried it off, mistaking it for bedding. The discovery set off laughter through the hollow, easing tension. Thieves indeed, Bramble chuckled. Only thieves of thread and fluff. Still, the lantern needed mending. Hazel brought it to Wren, whose careful paws polished the frame and fitted new glass. They replaced the wick, testing it with quiet diligence until the flame burned clear. When the lantern was rehung, the neighbors gathered to watch. Wren struck the match, lit the wick, and for the first time no one questioned whether they belonged. The flame glowed steadily, a symbol not only of light but of trust restored. That night, as Hazel walked home, she passed Wren near the hedge lantern. The pale mouse was gazing at the flame, their eyes full of quiet wonder. "I used to fear darkness," Wren murmured, "but here, there's always light enough to find the way." Hazel touched their shoulder, "and always pause to guide you, should you falter." Winter loosened its grip reluctantly, like an old blanket being folded away stitch by stitch. Snow still clung stubbornly to the hedge roots and shaded hollows, but the brook ran faster, swollen with meltwater, and the air carried the faintest scent of damp earth. Hazel woke one morning to hear dripping from the eaves of her roof and knew the first thaw had arrived. She bundled her scarf and set off down Elderberry Lane, paws crunching over a patchwork of ice and slush. At Clover's burrow, she found Wren outside with a broom, sweeping away clumps of snow from the doorstep. Their pale fur stood out bright against the dark, wet ground. "Clover says the sooner the paths are cleared, the less mess tracked inside," Wren explained, smiling faintly. Hazel joined in with her own broom. Together, they pushed the heavy piles toward the road where the sun could finish the work. Wren laughed softly when Hazel slipped on a patch of ice and caught herself awkwardly on the broom handle. It was the first time Hazel had heard them laugh so freely, and it warmed her more than the thawing air. Later that day, Bramble called for helpers at the brook. Ice had formed a stubborn blockage, and if it wasn't cleared, the water might flood the lane. Hazel, Wren, Pip, and Lark joined him with sticks and poles. The task was cold and wet. Water splashed high, soaking fur and mittens, but Wren surprised them all with their steady patience. Pip, grumbling with frozen paws, asked, "How can you stand this cold water?" Wren paused, droplets glittering on their whiskers. "Because it means the brook is alive again. Moving water is better than the silence of ice." By dusk, the brook gurgled freely once more, rushing between its banks. Bramble declared the work well done and passed around mugs of hot broth from a kettle he had carried down. They drank together on the bank, steam rising like mist. That evening, Hazel walked home with Wren at her side. The hedge lantern glowed ahead, haloed in damp air. Wren's voice was quiet but steady. "Each day here feels like a stitch, and I think the hollow is beginning to feel like a quilt I belong to." Hazel's whiskers twitched. "I think so too." As the ground softened, neighbors began preparing gardens for early planting. Hazel took pride in her small patch behind her burrow, where she always coaxed the first radishes to sprout. Wren, curious, asked if they might help. "Of course," Hazel said, "but be warned, it's muddy work." That afternoon they set to turning the soil. Hazel showed Wren how to loosen the clods with a small spade, while Pip and Lark cheerfully flung mud at each other until Clover scolded them from the gate. Soon Wren's paws were as dirty as Hazel's, but their eyes shone with quiet contentment. They uncovered earthworms wriggling from the thaw, and Hazel explained how worms were gardeners' helpers, keeping the soil rich. Then Wren's spade struck something hard. Together they scraped away the dirt to reveal an old wooden box, its lid warped but intact. The children squealed with excitement. Hazel brushed it clean, heart thumping. Buried treasure, perhaps. Inside they found not gold but a jumble of oddments, rusty nails, marbles clouded with age, and a little whistle carved from bone. Wren turned it over carefully. Someone must have hidden these long ago. Hazel smiled. Likely children of the hollow. Many seasons passed. The discovery caused quite a stir. Neighbors gathered to peer at the relics, each offering guesses. Mrs. Maple recalled tales of her grandmother burying timed chests for fun. "This may be one of them," she said. Though the box held nothing of real worth, Wren treated it as treasure all the same. They polished the whistle until it gleamed, then gifted it to Pip, who promptly filled the hollow with shrill toots until Clover threatened to confiscate it. Hazel kept one marble on her windowsill, where the light caught its cloudy swirl, and Wren, after mending the box's hinges, tucked it beside their bed at Clover's, as though the past had gifted them a place in its story. That evening, as lanterns were lit, Hazel mused aloud. Funny how even forgotten things can remind us we belong to a chain of seasons longer than ourselves. Wren nodded softly, and how even an old whistle can sound like home. The thaw brought mud, and mud brought mishaps. One particularly blustery afternoon, Hazel set off toward Mrs. Willow's with a basket of scones wrapped in cloth. Wren offered to accompany her, and together they braved the gusting wind. Halfway down the lane, a sudden blast caught Hazel off balance. The basket slipped from her paws, tumbling into the mud. Scones rolled everywhere, dotted with leaves and dirt. Hazel groaned, "Oh, bother," but Wren only laughed softly and knelt to gather them. A little mud can be brushed off, and perhaps Mrs. Willow won't mind. Hazel wasn't convinced. Muddy scones hardly seemed a proper gift, but Wren carefully wiped each one with the clean corner of the cloth, setting them back in the basket with surprising neatness. See? Still good. Maybe a bit earthy, but wholesome. When they arrived, Mrs. Willow indeed chuckled at the tale. A bit of mud never hurt anyone. Why? I remember once dropping an entire pie into the brook. She insisted they all share the scones with hot honey tea, mud forgotten. On the walk home, Hazel shook her head. "You've a way of making even small disasters seem bearable." Wren's ears twitched, embarrassed. When one has lost much, small mishaps matter less. If bread can be eaten, if warmth can be found, it's enough. Hazel thought of her own flustered reaction to the spill and felt humbled. Perhaps she had more to learn from the quiet mouse than she realized. That night, the wind eased and the lanterns shone steadily along the lanes. Hazel passed the hedge lantern, glowing as it always did, and realized that Wren's presence had become just as steady, a soft light, no longer a stranger's flame, but part of the hollow's own. The first true warmth of spring came suddenly, as though some great curtain of cloud had been pulled back to reveal blue skies and golden sun. Birds filled the air with busy chatter, and the hollow hummed with the sound of neighbors sweeping porches, airing quilts, and hanging laundry in the breeze. Hazel set out with Wren toward the orchard that bordered the hollow's west edge. The trees, still shy of leaves, had begun to bud, their branches tipped with green promise. Pip and Lark were already there, scrambling over roots in search of adventure. "Mind yourselves," Hazel called. "Those branches are not ladders." "They're nearly ladders," Pip retorted, his tail flicking. He shimmied up the lowest bough with alarming speed. Lark, not to be outdone, followed. Hazel sighed. "Every spring it's the same." Wren smiled faintly. "Where I grew up, my brothers and I climbed pines far taller than these. I was always the last up, the slowest. But the view," their gaze drifted skyward. "It was worth the scrapes." Encouraged, Hazel tried climbing the lowest branch. Wren steadied her as she scrambled awkwardly. They both laughed when she nearly lost her footing. It was not the dignified climb of childhood anymore, but the silliness was good for the heart. Then, inevitably, Pip slipped, one careless paw on moss, and he tumbled from a branch, landing with a squeal in a heap of last year's leaves. Hazel and Wren rushed over, hearts pounding, but he popped up grinning, only a bit bruised. "You'll break your tail one day," Hazel scolded, though relief softened her tone. To distract him, Wren examined the mossy roots and pointed out where violets had begun to bloom. Pip forgot his fall in an instant, showing them proudly to Lark. The tumble became the day's tale, retold with growing exaggeration. Pip falling from the highest branch, Pip flipping midair, Pip saved only by a heroic cushion of leaves. Hazel shook her head at each retelling, but Wren laughed, their shoulders loose and easy. When the sun dipped low, the orchard seemed gilded, shadows stretching long. Hazel and Wren walked home with Pip and Lark skipping ahead, and Hazel thought of how laughter, like climbing trees, was a way of reaching higher than one's fears. Spring meant planting, and soon every lane was alive with neighbors bent over their garden rows. Hazel, proud of her neat radishes, worked side by side with Wren, who handled the seeds as delicately as beads of glass. Straight rows, Hazel instructed, otherwise Clover will shake her head at us. Wren concentrated, tongue between their teeth, carefully dropping each seed. Their lines were neat, though Hazel noticed they hummed softly while working, a tune both unfamiliar and soothing. Mrs. Maple stopped by with a basket of onion sets and peered critically at their rows. Not bad for beginners, she teased. Wren flushed, but Hazel defended them warmly. Straighter than mine last year. Together, they planted radishes, carrots, peas, and lettuce. Pip and Lark, given the task of watering, promptly drenched each other more than the soil until Clover chased them off with stern but fond words. Later, Wren surprised Hazel by mending her old watering can, which had leaked since last season. A patch of tin, a few stitches of wire, they explained, demonstrating proudly. Hazel tested it and found not a drop spilled. See, Wren said softly, even a crooked can has use if mended with care. That evening, neighbors strolled through the lanes, admiring each other's plots. Wren stood quietly beside Hazel as Clover praised their handiwork. Hazel noticed how Wren's ears tilted shyly at the compliments and used as such open approval. When twilight fell, they lingered by the hedge lantern. Wren bent, brushing soil from their paws. I never thought I'd plant roots again, real ones in earth. But today, I felt as though these rows might hold me in place. Hazel touched their shoulder, and soon enough, you'll see sprouts rising. Proof that new beginnings can take hold anywhere. The hollow was never a place of grand feasts, but neighbors often shared meals, especially when planting or harvest made for long days. That spring, Clover invited a few of them for supper. Hazel, Bramble, Mrs. Maple, and, most significantly, Wren. Hazel helped carry baskets of turnips and fresh greens to Clover's kitchen. Wren set the table, careful and precise, folding napkins with quiet pride. When Bramble arrived with a loaf of bread and Mrs. Maple contributed onion soup, the room filled with the warm, homely sense of shared labor. At first, Wren sat shyly, unsure whether to speak. But Clover, with her gentle authority, drew them in. Wren, tell us of your pine wood. Did you really hear the trees hum? So Wren spoke, hesitant at first, then with growing steadiness, of tall pines swaying in unison, of rivers that glittered under moonlight, of a house built snug beneath tree roots. The table fell quiet, listening. Hazel noticed Bramble nodding, a rare smile on his broad face. Mrs. Maple dabbed her eyes. Such poetry from one so young, she murmured. When laughter followed, over Pip and Lark sneaking biscuits, over Bramble's tale of falling asleep in his own turnip patch, Wren joined in. Their laughter, once timid, rang clear. By the end of supper, when Clover pressed an extra slice of pie into Wren's paws, Hazel saw something shift. It was not spoken aloud, but it was understood. Wren was no longer a guest. They had been given a seat at the table, and with it, a place in the hollow's heart. That night, as lanterns flickered along the lanes, Hazel paused outside Clover's burrow. Inside, she could still hear laughter and the clink of dishes, and she knew that just as surely as seeds were sprouting in the garden rows, Wren's roots had begun to anchor themselves deep in Elderberry Lane. Thank you for wandering through the woodland with us today. If you enjoyed your visit to Old Fernwood, don't forget to leave a like share this tale with a friend, and subscribe for more cozy stories. Until next time, may your days be calm, your hearth warm, and your heart light.